Okay, thank you so much for coming today. It's great to introduce the third panel, and it sort of feels like a natural focus to move from sort of understanding, why we should care about wealth inequality to how we got here, and now to talking specifically about its political consequences and wealth inequality and authoritarianism. My brief but pleasant job is to introduce Ya-Wen, who's a professor in the Department of Sociology at Harvard University and a former junior fellow at Harvard Society of Fellows, which is quite an esteemed group. She's also affiliated with the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies and serves as a senior scholar with the Weatherhead Center's Academy Scholar Program. Her research examines political and socioeconomic transformations with a particular focus on the relationship between technology, society, and political economy. She's the author of 2 books, The Contentious Public Sphere, Law, Media, and Authoritarian Rule in China, and more recently, The Gilded Cage, Techno-State Capitalism in China, published in 2023. And that has received 7 national and international awards, which is a nice round number. Her work has appeared in leading sociological journals, including the Annual Review of Sociology, American Sociological Review, and the American Journal of Sociology. And she has received extensive recognition from many learning societies, including the American Sociological Association, the Law and Society Association, the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics, and the China Quarterly. So this is going to be a great panel. Let me turn it over to you. Thank you so much to all 4 of you for being here.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor to join the panel. I'm actually the only person who doesn't really study inequality. But then because I study authoritarian regimes, so I'm very honored to be able to participate in the panel. And so our organizing question in this panel asks how political regimes both produce social inequality and are in turn shaped by social inequality across both authoritarian and democratic contexts. As we know that political reality exists along a broad spectrum rather than a dichotomy. But still, we think it's very analytical, useful to consider how social inequality is produced in regime where political power is highly concentrated, for example, in China. And in such contexts, political inequality is especially pronounced because elites are positioned to use their concentrated authority and to shape socioeconomic outcomes, often in ways that favor those with proximity to power. And this concentration of power generates a distinct challenge for legitimacy. So as all of us know that unlike democracy, which rely primarily on procedural legitimacy, Sociology 101, and just the rules, elections, and institutionalized forms of accountability. But highly concentrated regimes such as China rely more heavily on performance-based legitimacy. And so this creates a very complex bidirectional relationship. So on the one hand, so the political regime may use their authority to tilt economic outcomes in ways that benefits elites, but rising social inequality can simultaneously undermine the very performance claim on which regime stability depends. I just give you a fun fact. So between 2002 and 2012, the Chinese government stopped publishing a Gini coefficient after they realized that actually China's Gini coefficient surpassed the Gini coefficient of the United States. So that really shows you the importance of social inequality in terms of the regime, like stability. So finally, political regimes are not static. So ongoing pattern of democratic backsliding remind us that the boundary between democratic and authoritarian governance is often fluid rather than fixed. So that makes it especially important to understand the social consequences of inequality within democratic context as well, particularly how sustained inequality can generate instability and over time really weaken, undermine democratic institutions themselves. So to explore this dynamic, we are joined by a distinguished panel. So our first speaker, Professor David Yan, he is the Yvonne P.L. Liu Professor of Economics at Harvard University. He is also my colleague at Harvard's Fairbanks Center of China Study. So David also directs the Center for History and Economics and at Harvard, and Scholars House, a China Research Hub in Tokyo. I envy him a lot to be able to have a research center in Tokyo. And his research focuses on authoritarian regimes, technology, and data-driven geopolitics. So his work offers very powerful insights into how information, data, and technology reshape political power and inequality in the contemporary world. And our second speaker is Daron Acemoglu, who doesn't really need introduction, as we all know that he's an institute professor at MIT, and he has published numerous numbers of books, and I'm a big fan of his work, and he is one of the most respected economists among sociologists. You know, we have some kind of discipline friction. Sometimes sociology criticize economists about not citing sociologists' work, and but then or kind of neglecting like the role, for example, of culture in explanation. But then I know that in my department, most of the faculty members really love his work, and yeah, so it's really I'm just be very happy to be on this journal, and I don't want to spend more time introducing him. And our third speaker is Professor Sheri Berman, a professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University, and she is a leading scholar of democracy and dictatorship, populism, fascism, and European politics. And her most recent book, Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, offers a sweeping historical account of regime change. And her forthcoming book examines the political consequences of neoliberalism for the left and for democracy. And her work is really fascinating because it brings the ideology, political agency back into our discussion of inequality and political regime. So with that, let me welcome David to begin.
Thank you so much for having me. I actually have some slides right here. So we've spent quite a bit of time in the last two panels talking about the relationship between democratic institution and inequality. And given this panel is about authoritarian regimes and other political arrangements, I want to broaden our scope to think about other political institutions and how it might affect inequality. Okay. Now, to think about sort of how political structure is going to affect in non-democracy to affect inequality outcome, we really need to think about two items here. One is the policy dynamics. How are policies being made? What are the underlying political and bureaucratic institutions that's underlying how policy is being put forward in non-democratic regimes, which could look very different and embedded in a very different bureaucratic environment than in a democratic environment. And two is, what are authoritarian regimes' core objective functions? Different potentially from election or getting re-elected, authoritarian regimes are fundamentally motivated by survivalhood. And that means that it's not that the regimes are not responsive to popular demands or to citizens' demands of anything. They're responsive to a very different kind of preferences or incidents that might challenge or threaten the survivalhood. And to understand sort of where does that core sort of threats to survivalhood operates and then can shift sort of policy is going to affect potentially structurally on inequality. Of course, it's going to be very difficult to make these broad claims about all authoritarian regimes since many of them are functioning very differently. So I'm going to put forward some of the recent lessons we've learned on contemporary China on some of the research we've done recently. The first one is going to be about policy dynamics. So many have sort of been described that the reason why China has grown and China has transitioned away from the communist environment because it has institutionalized a very smooth policy experimentation regimes where when central governments still implement national policy, it systematically try this policy out in a couple of localities and evaluate the policy outcome before they put forward the policy to become a national one. So we went to try to collect all the policy experiments, about 700 of them that have ever happened in the country over the last couple of decades, and try to ask the question, how does experiments being run? They're certainly started in an era where the randomized control trial concept wasn't there yet. And is there any systematic biases that's being generated through this policy-making environment, and that might have inequality consequences structurally? So what we find is that among all the policy experiments that's been happening in China, an overwhelming large share of them, more than 90% actually, are happening or implemented in places that are substantially richer than the poor places. So take sort of the most simplifying version of it. Vast majority of the policy experiments that are happening that are meant to be informing governments about national policy are being tried out in places like Shanghai, and it's eventually becoming a national policy. Governments are making sort of taking informed signal from the experiments. So the experiments that have generated better social, economic, or better growth outcomes are more likely to be put forward as national policy. But those policies that become national policy are much more likely to have a deteriorated effects compared to when the policy was being tried out. So that means there's going to be a structural process in which the policies that's being put forward as national policy in China that were favoring rich places, because those are the policies being tried, and that are shown much less effects on poorer places. And you can explain a lot of the regional inequality that is being enlarging by this very different policy-making mechanisms. So just to show you one example. Okay. A second sort of case I want to make is who is the authoritarian regime such as China responsive to? Whose interests are being voiced the loudest? So here the answer is going to be a bit more sort of nuanced and mixed. If we think that one of the key sort of moments in which authoritarian regimes feel threatened is the large and successful coordination of collective action, those are potentially things in which authoritarian regimes are going to be responsive in their policy leverage. So what I show in this picture is that when we look at all the protests that's happened in China in the last decade, that's about, for example, land disputes. There are about 10,000 of them during this time period. And many of them are happening in the border between rural and urban area. We see sort of in that area in which land disputes are happening through large successful collective action, the price of land that the government are paying, compensating for the land that's being transferred from the rural households, for example, to the local governments are substantially higher. In a sense, the property rights are being respected and get back to the right market sort of value. But that's going to be very concentrated just in the places where the protest has been occurring. It's not generating a large sort of market shifts in the average prices, but the governments are just doing so to sort of in responsive to the successful protests. And that same is happening to labor disputes as well. If you manage to successfully sort of stage labor disputes, we see sort of governments are paying out of their pockets to compensate for private firms to try to transfer for money because they're hypersensitive to making sure those protests are not spreading and so on. So in other sense, you can think about a regime that actually are very responsive and very, very sensitive to the demands of the bottom because they can stage this protests. Structurally, we know this is not unique to China, but around the world that vast majority of the protests are happening in urban area, especially by the urban younger population. So to preemptively try to make sure those protests don't happen, we see sort of a lot of the pro-urban policies, for example, suppressing agricultural output prices and so on. That's essentially shifting sort of resources, redistributing resources away from the rural poor to support the urban rich. And you can think about that as a way to motivate the regimes to make sure the urban population are happier because their threshold of staging a protest and certain regime is much greater. So that sort of concludes my remark in the sense of to understand how institution, especially in a non-democratic environment that can generate sort of inequality, we need to think about how policies are being made. And there are many sort of nuanced institutional sort of arrangements in which structural inequality might be embedded. That's either spatial or cross-income distribution. And two is that to understand the objective function that the regimes are not responsive to the median voter in this case, but responsive to the population that are potentially very threatening to the regime that can push inequality in different direction. They might favoring the poor because the poor can be desperate and stage protests, and that can provide a lot of incentive for distribution. But it can also systematically favoring the urban rich because they are known to be the ones that can stage a large collective action that can really pose a threat to the regime. So let me end here, and very much looking forward to the questions and so on.
Thank you, David. Daron, please.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be part of this panel. And I guess, one question that some of you may ask is, could anything be worse than to live in a society with gargantuan, astronomic, unfair levels of inequality, of income, wealth, access, opportunity. And for some people, including me, the answer would be yes, to do so in an authoritarian, repressive society. So the question is, how could we end up in an authoritarian, repressive society that's so unequal? And once we end up there, I think everybody understands that there would be certain forces that would keep us there. Authoritarianism empowers certain people who would then, become more dominant, and the inequality that it breeds perhaps could become more rooted. Now, I think one complication, especially for thinking about this, is in the context of legitimacy, which is, could authoritarian regimes really transition to being very, very unequal? And I think from history we know the answer is sometimes yes, but for many authoritarian regimes, even though they obviously create a huge amount of unfair inequality because they privilege those who are politically connected and those who have important resources for the survival of the regime, they also have constraints. And those constraints, and I think they were also implicit in what David was discussing, are related to the fact that many authoritarian regimes have thin legitimacy, meaning that they do not really have a general buy-in from the public. And as a result of that, they could not afford a completely out of control increase in inequality for fear of being toppled. Another very important consideration, I think, for the inequality authoritarianism link, though here immense inequality that Liz was mentioning may fall into a different bucket, is that many of these regimes suppress the middle class. And suppressing the middle class reduces many of the standard measures of wealth inequality. So we see this, communist countries not being so unequal, China under Mao not having a huge amount of inequality and the suppression of the middle class, but even more sort of extreme is the case of apartheid, where the fall of apartheid, rather than reducing inequality, both wealth and income in South Africa, led to a huge increase because the black middle class that was suppressed started becoming more alive and independent. So I think there are these limits to how authoritarianism can lead to this immense inequality, although I think there are examples, and we're seeing in China, that a certain amount of immense inequality is increasing. So the other part of the ledger, which I think Sheri will also talk about, is, well, what about unequal societies turning into authoritarianism more and more? And I think there, the dangers are actually much more present, especially for places like the United States today, because there are two basic mechanisms that are very important for that sort of inequality to authoritarianism link to emerge. And we have to watch out for both of them. There's a lot that we don't know. And one is that, of course, as more inequality builds up, those who have greater wealth and greater access are going to try to break parts of the democratic process, decision-making, in order to gain advantages, and that's going to eat into the democratic fabric and might prepare some kinds of grounds for authoritarianism. But even in this case, I think the bigger sort of channel is again through legitimacy. And here, I think the situation is more complex than in the authoritarian regimes, and that source of complexity comes from the fact that democratic governments, democratic societies, often vest their legitimacy and claims of legitimacy in the fact that they provide services and good things for their society, which includes shared prosperity. So once inequality starts building up, I think it also naturally erodes democracy's claim for legitimacy. And for example, some of the work I've done with a number of co-authors shows that support for democracies is very strongly related to how democratic countries are able to deliver economic growth, lower inequality, control of corruption, public services, and so on. And once democracy starts to underperform in these dimensions, it's going to sort of eat into its own legitimacy. And in fact, I think right now, the real danger that we're facing is for this sort of the twin fear of very, very high inequality and authoritarianism is really that there is a sense, and that sense has some validity, that liberal democracy is in crisis. And that is part of what I've been working on, and I'm going to have a book on this out in August. But I think liberal democracy's crisis is related to a sense of crisis, to this legitimacy being lost, because many of the promises that liberal democracy made, including procedural ones about voice, but also outcome-based ones in terms of shared prosperity, high-quality public goods, haven't been realized. And that is quite structurally related to inequality. In the United States and many other industrialized nations, shared prosperity has weakened, in part because inequality has become a real burden, and inequality has become a real burden because, in part, shared prosperity hasn't worked. But there you see the real danger, because now you have a double whammy. Democracy is, at the same time, creating a class of people who are very hard to control. At the same time, it's also destroying its own legitimacy that would make people rally around liberal democratic institutions. And I think the real danger that for many people would have been, probably including me, would have been beyond the pale 15 years ago, that industrialized, well-established democracies, including United States and several others in Europe and other parts of the world, would really be not only reaching astronomical levels of inequality, but also, together with that, all sorts of democratic checks and support for democracy would be collapsing. Well, that is no longer beyond the pale. Thank you.
All right. It's no great treat to have to go last among this bunch, but I'll give it a shot. This is a symposium on why inequality matters, and I probably don't have to convince anyone that it does, but given the particular title of this section of the symposium, it matters because, as you can see from this chart, it is correlated with democratic erosion. This is true, actually. Social science research, including research done by people in this room, has shown of other trends that have accompanied inequality over the last decades: trade shocks, financial crises, growing precarity, right? So we know that this correlation exists. At the same time as these trends have happened, though, what we've seen in the United States and in Europe is that people have increasingly voted not on the basis of their economic preferences and interests, but rather on the basis of their social and cultural ones. So we've had these dangerous economic trends, but voters on both sides of the Atlantic are voting more on their social and cultural preferences than on their economic ones. And this has had the kind of perverse, perhaps, consequence of making illiberal, right-wing, populist, and even anti-democratic parties the primary beneficiaries of these economic trends over the past decades. Now, I suppose everybody in this room thinks dealing with these economic trends head-on is absolutely necessary to deal with the potential for economic erosion, to fight back against authoritarianism. So we need to understand why this is the case, why at the same time that we've had these economic trends, people have been voting increasingly on the basis of their social and cultural preferences. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And before I do, I want to start by dismissing two very common answers to this question, or explanations for this trend. The first is that people are not voting to deal with these economic problems, inequality, for example, because this reflects their economic preferences. Voters are broadly conservative economically. They don't view these trends as particularly problematic, or they don't actually want governments to deal with them. So that's one explanation. Second explanation, particularly common in the United States, is that voters have actually been duped, right? They've been tricked by right-wing parties into voting against their economic interests. Working class voters, other economically disadvantaged voters have been basically tricked by right-wing politicians and parties by their manufacturing of, resentment against liberal elites, against minorities, against immigrants, and yada, yada, yada. In the US, Thomas Frank's, What's the Matter with Kansas was the sort of granddaddy in this genre, but there's a whole slew of books basically claiming that economically disadvantaged voters are suffering from a form of false consciousness, right? And if you remember, as I'm sure, maybe not the students, but the other people in this room do, Obama's famous comment about, people taking solace in guns and religion, This is a version of that argument. Now, these are the two most common arguments, and there's really no evidence for either one of them. So if we look at the first one, for example, working class voters, this is in the United States, remain economically very progressive on both pre-distribution policies like limits on free trade, support for minimum wage, support for strengthening unions, job guarantees, and also on redistributive policies. This varies somewhat between the US and Europe. Europeans are generally more supportive of redistributive policies than Americans are, but even in the United States, the working class remains very progressive on redistributive policies, increasing spending on Social Security and health care, taxing the rich, yada, yada, yada. Not only has the working class not become less economically progressive, over the past years in the United States, the middle and even upper middle class has grown more economically progressive as well. It's important to note, and here I'm going to take advantage of the fact that Oren Cass is in this room. It's important to note that these trends are not limited to Democratic Party voters. As a very good study by Oren Cass and his think tank has shown, even Republican voters, or rather the Republican electorate, has shifted away from conservative economic views over time. The mean Republican voter in the United States is now economically centrist or moderate. This is, of course, because there are more working class and economically disadvantaged voters in that Republican coalition. All right, so how about the second explanation for this? The second explanation, you have to recognize that for voters to vote on the basis of their economic preferences and interests, they must view a party as being willing and able to address those interests and preferences. During the post-war decades in both the United States and Europe, voters did primarily vote on the basis of their economic interests and preferences. This meant, of course, that things like income and wealth were the best predictors of voting during the post-war decades, and this meant that working class and other economically disadvantaged voters voted disproportionately for center-left parties, the Democratic Party in the United States, Social Democratic, Socialist, Labor parties in Europe. But beginning in the late 20th century, the profiles of these parties, their brands, if you want to think of them that way, of these center-left parties were transformed as a result of two interrelated trends. First, these parties shifted their economic profiles, right? Particularly on issues like free trade and market regulation. They really changed the policies that they presented to voters, the economic priorities, their understandings of the relationship of the market, the relationship between the market and government, yada, yada, yada. I don't have to go over this. I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with it. At the same time as they sort of converged with the right on economic policy, they also, these parties did, increasingly emphasized non-economic, social, and cultural issues and shifted to the left on these issues. Why is this important? Because it shifted them, center-left parties, away from the social and cultural preferences of working class voters, rural voters, other economically disadvantaged voters. The cumulative result of both of these trends is that working class and other economically disadvantaged voters no longer viewed center-left parties as championing their economic interests and preferences, but rather as prioritizing the interests of other groups. And I will note that in the United States, the group that is given most often as being prioritized by the Democratic Party is LGBTQ people. This meant that these voters were now free to vote on the basis of their social and cultural preferences, right? Where, again, as I noted, these center-left parties had moved away from them. These voters, I want to stress, working class voters, rural voters, did not become more conservative on their social and cultural preferences. Rather, the Democratic Party became much more liberal or progressive on them, right? And so you've probably all seen a version of this, I think, rather tragic chart from the last election that showed that kind of the median mean voter actually saw Donald Trump as being closer to them ideologically than it did the Democratic Party. I want to stress that for the United States, this has been talked about a lot with regards to working class voters or non-college educated voters. It doesn't really matter that much how you talk about them. The shifts are the same. But this is also true, perhaps less well known for rural voters. Obviously, rural areas are the other major sort of economically disadvantaged group, rural voters, right? Because they're living in regions that have really fallen behind. Up through the 1990s, there was no divergence between how voters in rural areas voted in the United States. They voted pretty equally for Democrats and Republicans. The trigger here for these voters, again, was this economic shift, right? They no longer saw the Democratic Party after the 1990s in particular as championing their economic interests and preferences. And this set off a really very bad chain reaction, bad from the perspective of the Democratic Party, in that these voters rapidly changed their allegiance. So let me end here just by saying that if the goal is to deal with problematic economic trends like inequality, right? If we want to fight inequality, we have to really understand how and why we ended up with the political alignments that we got today, because these political alignments with so many of these economically disadvantaged voters in the Republican Party really enormously complicates our ability to deal with it. Not because of the great efforts by people like Orrin Cass and others to get the Republican Party to consider these issues more, but because the nature of the coalitions within these two parties now makes it extraordinarily, or complicates it greatly, to deal with these issues. And we can talk more about why that might be the case. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the three panelists for the incredible remarks. So let me just ask some, because all of you mentions allude to some variation within the regime, because even though we talk about the differences between democratic and authoritarian regime, but as, for example, like Daron mentioned that like within authoritarian regime, there is a huge variation. For example, when we think about like the case of Taiwan and South Korea, before they actually democratized, actually the level of inequalities actually was very, very low. And then even within the case of China, I don't know, many of you actually know Professor Ya-Wen at Sloan School. So he kind of showed that the developmental model before the 1989 actually led to kind of very low level of inequality. But then things have become actually very different after the elites actually adopt a more pro-urban ideology and developmental model. So I'm just, and also like a lot of authoritarian countries are very different. For example, like in China, in country with socialist foundation, they have the official like socialism as their ideology, but some other countries don't have that. So I'm just thinking about kind of how to really think about this kind of variation within the regime. And also Sheri talked about, I know you are a Europeanist, but today you focus on the American case, and you talk about the alliance pattern in the US and the role, the changing role of the central left party. And could you please tell us more about, like, to what extent your explanation here actually hold true in other contexts, or do you have other observation and explanation of, for example, the rise of the right-wing parties and also the impact of inequality in Europe? Yeah, for example. Yeah, thank you.
Do you want us to go in a?
Yeah, you can feel free to.
So there's some very similar trends in Europe, but also some differences. As far as the party differences are concerned, what we've seen in Europe, right, is these center-left parties have become small versions of themselves. They would get 30, sometimes more than 30% during the post-war decades. Now they're basically fringe parties in a lot of places. Why? For precisely the same reasons we saw in the United States, right? With proportional representation systems, what you've had is highly educated citizens who really have these very strong priorities on social and cultural issues, switching to new left and green parties, and working class and rural voters have basically switched to the populist right. So you see similar dynamics, but somewhat different political outcomes. I will say one thing that's interesting, though, where Western Europe in particular is weirdly, I would say, a generation or a decade or two in front of the United States, right, is that in Western Europe, many of these populist right-wing parties, precisely because they are so heavily working class, have really shifted to be what are sometimes referred to as welfare chauvinist parties, right? They are very pro-welfare state. They are very anti-free trade. They are very sovereigntist. And so they are, in some sense, 10 or 20 years ahead of the Republican Party, but they are not burdened by the Republican Party's divergence on economic interests that are within the party. And so it's much easier for them to shift course, I think, than it is for the Republican Party to do so. So somewhat similar underlying economic trends, but somewhat different political outcomes, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything exactly that Sheri said. The important variables here that we haven't studied enough in political science and economics, perhaps a little bit more in sociology, but not enough, is I think what the determinants of legitimacy. And distinct from that, related, is trust in institutions. I think for authoritarian regimes, there is quite a lot of variation in terms of legitimacy. So for example, Latin American dictatorships never had any legitimacy, whereas China, the Chinese Communist Party, has some degree of legitimacy, some of it ideological, some of it related to high degree of state capacity, quite meritocratic recruitment into some positions. There might also be a cultural element, not sure. But that, I think, is one very important aspect. I think legitimacy is lost in many of the democratic societies, both in Europe and the United States, and you can see that from the fact that being associated with the establishment has been a kiss of death. So the more associated with the establishment you are, the more of a penalty you seem to suffer. But there seems to be quite a lot of difference in terms of how little or how much trust there is in institutions. So in the United States, there's also been a complete trust in institutions, which makes it very difficult for democratic governance to use the institutional tools it has to reverse the problems, whereas in Europe, perhaps that trust hasn't completely collapsed. In Canada, it hasn't collapsed to any degree similar to that in the United States. So, but those are things that we don't fully understand. So I think any sort of holistic analysis of our political economy trajectories will have to pay more attention to these things.
Yeah, and how about David?
So I think, I guess one piece to add to that discussion of legitimacy and sort of also the internal evolution of the political system is that if you look at China and sort of the composition of the National Representative Congress in early 2000s, there's not a single one of them who are in the private sector. And now we're talking about a third of the composition who are in the private sector, and total wealth is massively concentrated among the representatives. Now you can sort of wonder, that might be just a rubber stamp institution that don't do anything to the policies and so on. But it turns out sort of the representatives have a much higher chance of being put forward formal proposals on policy change. And when we look at sort of the things they propose and on a particular industry that the policy change is inducing, we see a lot more favorable policy that's being revised and redrafted that favoring the policy recommendation that the representatives themselves are put forward. So you have a party that's shifting their claim for legitimacy in the early period was that are pro-equality and potentially pro-poor to a period where to grow out of, to really put a lot of the legitimacy on growth and try to put political representation through the private sector, and that shifts the policy dynamics in that way. And now it's very hard to sort of reshift the composition because now you have a lot of political power concentrated by the private sector, even in the Communist Party's National Congress, and that recomposition changes even within that system is going to be harder to deal with.
Thank you, and I do agree that study legitimacy is crucial because we tend to really assume the form or the existence of legitimacy. For example, for people who study China, I mean, people just said that, oh, there is a contract between people and the government. As long as the economy is growing, then people are satisfied with the government. But is that true? I'm not really sure. And now the economy slowed down, and where is the source of the legitimacy actually remains actually unknown, I mean, for me. And I'm also very interested in like the changing global context and geopolitics, because a lot of the phenomenon, like all of you kind of mentioned, like especially Sheri, related to the certain kind of stage of globalization, like neoliberal globalization, and as the macro transnational order has been shifting. Now we are in an era in which we don't really know about the political, like international, transnational order. And how would you, because the previous stage of globalization has its discontent, right? And it's actually this kind of transnational context is related to the domestic context. For example, in China, they benefit tremendously from this, like the incorporation to the regime, the world, the trade, WTO, and then, but the inequality level has also been rising. So I'm just interested in how do you see this kind of changing political, like context, the context of political economy at the global level would influence the future pattern of between the inequality and political regime. Yeah, this is kind of thinking about the future. Yeah, thinking about the changing international, transnational context, a new kind of global order.
I guess maybe I'll start with just one observation. Changing global orders is a very big phenomenon, but if we just focus on increasing global power, sort of great power competition, just focus on US and China. And if we look at sort of where we started on the composition of GDP growth and income, about 80 to 85% of the US GDP is composite of household income, so which means the vast majority of the wealth that's been created is it's a different question for inequality, but it sits within the household broadly defined. That number is 40% for China, so which means less than half of the Chinese GDP sits in the hands of the household. Now, why does that matter in increasing geopolitical competition? Well, that's going to give states going to have increasing incentive to try to hold more control of resources, because that's going to helpful for direct resources into the strategic industry that households may not get that necessary benefits. So to the extent that there has been a lot of economic policy proposals try to argue for pushing the household income share away from this very low number, 40%, I think the sort of the changing world order is not helping that at all. If anything, sort of we see policy shifting towards the states want to take more share of that pie, because that's going to give the state capacity a bigger way to alleviate resource constraint and then bottlenecks coming from the geopolitical tension on uncertainty, which will affect domestic inequality greatly.
Yeah, I think David tackled the changing global order geopolitics a little bit. So let me talk about some other aspect of it, which I think is a contributor to inequality, and the fact that we're seeing inequality sort of as a very, rightly a very difficult problem, is that a lot of economic activity now is beyond borders. And the 10 richest companies, the 10 big companies that make up 45% or so of the US stock market, they're all completely global. So it's very difficult, even with US laws that really are supposed to apply even when you're abroad, it's very difficult to regulate these companies. And the problems that these companies create, from taxation of capital to pollution to AI risks and other problems, they're all global. And we just don't have global institutions. Supranational institutions are extremely weak, and they have become weaker over time with the sort of the rise of US-China competition. So I think that is a real barrier to both limiting inequality that's rooted in the economic activities of increasingly globalized large corporations, and also regulating how the power of these corporations, which Liz was talking about, the private government aspect of it, can be regulated. Because I think many of your examples come from the domestic setting, but in fact their reach is much more global. So even if the US voter wanted to do that, it would be much harder. So I think that's an important aspect of, again, the legitimacy of democratic governments, that they cannot deal with one of the most important sources of economic and social power in their society.
I'm gonna pass to the economists the questions about the global economy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually also have a question about technology, and I really hated the fact that Gary already asked the question in the second panel, and because I'm sorry, Sheri, we have like two experts who study the political economy of technology. And then in this kind of, and David also studied geopolitics, right? And in this kind of changing geopolitical context, and every powerful country is pursuing so-called technological self-reliance, right? And then they compete with each other and to secure the supply chain to have the most cutting-edge technology. And in this kind of regimes, they also have powerful group to lobby. And how do you see this? How do you factor in technology in your observation about the relationship between political regimes and inequality?
I'll start, and then I think David has much more to add on this. But a lot of my research that intersects with technology and political economy is about direction of innovation, direction of technology. And one of the problems of inequality of power, especially inequality of social power, during periods that are very transformative in terms of the new technologies they come, is that the way that we develop these technologies is influenced by existing power structures. And I think a lot of the concerns that people have, rightly, very rightly, about AI, for example, both in terms of what AI will do to inequality, to jobs, and also what it will do to democracy, they are all rooted in a direction of AI development that's very much influenced by the most powerful and most the largest corporations and most powerful people in this country without any democratic checks. So one of the very large costs of inequality in some sense is that it also tends to distort the direction of technology. That is costly during normal periods, but I think during such periods as the development of AI, it becomes truly a problem.
Right, and also in the US, a lot of these big tech CEO usually just argue the fact that we have to loosen the regulation because we have to compete with China.
Yes, right? If China did not exist, they would have had to invent it.
So I will add maybe a point to go back to my earlier comment about to understand what's the state's objective function in this, especially when states can play a role in shaping technological direction and investments. When we look at all the private VC capital and then the type of AI firms that's been funded by them in China, in this case, in the last 10 years, and look at all the government-funded VC, which are also a very large entity, and so we're talking about 600 trillion of fundraise during this time period. You see the performance of the AI firms that's being supported by private VC, which you can think about the benchmark of what the capital market will be pushing or incentivize. Versus what the governments will have a mixed incentive of return and potentially other political incentives. We see the government VC invested AI firms in China are a bit less outperforming in terms of the growth and productivity. But one thing that really set them apart is that the type of jobs that these firms are creating, both are creating a lot of jobs in high skill human capital, but the government-supported VC firms are providing way more jobs in a low skill human capital as well. That's probably is because the governments are hypersensitive to unemployment and want to make sure that is part of the metrics. That may not be the silver bullet a solution, because the type of AI firms that these type of firms are supporting are the kind of very data labeling intensive jobs firms that may not be the right industry or direction that to put forward. But to the extent that you can have some combination of having a different employment and labor market conservation than the pure return-driven market will dictate. That's going to be a financial market solution that we see that's been happening in China in the last decade.
Yeah, and thank you so much. I think we still have 8 minutes for discussion, so let's just open the floor. Yeah, feel free to come over to ask questions.
I have a quick question, because this is about political economy and inequality and so forth. When Keynes wrote 110 so years ago, the economic consequences of the peace and so forth in the 1910s, we had one declining hegemon, the UK, and one emerging hegemon, the US. And now I feel that we're kind of 110 years later in a period of a declining hegemon, this is the US, and an emerging hegemon, China. Now, you could debate that, and we can say how long it takes and everything, but they're already the manufacturing hegemon. So how does that influence all of this? And are there any lessons? Maybe this is my key question for further research. Is there any lessons as to how the UK handled that in terms of inequality and what happened politically as they were watching the US pass?
Would any of you want to? Yeah, I want to. Right.
Well, no, I didn't know if you wanted to take more questions or you wanted us to.
So maybe we can take off the question and we can answer the questions together. Yeah, you can decide which questions to answer. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. With China slow down, the economy slow down right now because of the local government, the revenue most from the land transaction. Within past 5 years, they lost this income. And the employment, 73% from private sector. So the question is, how can we handle the labor relation at this situation?
You had mentioned earlier that one thing that changed a lot recently is that both of the parties are not really in favor of the working class. And there's been like this shift. So I was wondering if there was any way that we could shift back.
Thank you. And perhaps, Sheri, do you want to start? Yeah.
Well, I'll start with your question. I mean, the thing that was so unusual, obviously, about the transition from British to American hegemony is that between those two hegemons, it was peaceful, right? And so, you know, that was something that I remember, and perhaps you do, 20 or 30 years ago was much discussed, right? Which is there clearly was a rising power, perhaps not a rising, an alternative hegemon, but certainly a rising great power. What were the ways in which that transition in power relations could be made to be as peaceful as possible? I think that conversation has moved on, unfortunately, right? And this was something that obviously Keynes was concerned about, albeit from a somewhat different perspective. I mean, Britain went on to, fortunately, be on the winning side in the Second World War, and then to implement a great welfare state reform after, and went off into its sort of transition to middle powerdom in an incredibly peaceful way from a comparative historical perspective. Usually those kinds of transitions are really quite ugly, both internationally and domestically. So that, in some sense, is a kind of, you know, victory for the Brits. As far as your question is concerned, I mean, look, the problem that we have in the United States today is that we have a Republican Party with a growing number of economically disadvantaged voters, but also still heavily dependent on an incredibly wealthy elite. So their incentive to punt on a lot of economic questions and double down on social and cultural ones where their electorate is united is very high. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, has voters that are more united on economic preferences, but are quite divided on social and cultural ones. And we can see the way this has infected both policymaking and the way in which the party has presented itself to voters. So this is the problem that we face in the United States, right? Which is that we have these terrible economic problems, but the coalitions that currently exist within both of those parties vastly complicate the ability of either one of them to deal with those problems head on.
Okay, let me also add some things to that. You know, I think it's a great question to look for historical precedents to learn from it. But I think, as Sheri said, there is a limited amount that we can learn because U.S. and Britain were sort of allies, both in the First World War and then the Second World War. The joke being, sorry, Simon, that Britain always fights to the last American. So that transition was bound to be much smoother than China versus US, who are not allies, and they are representing very different poles. And I think the big problem that creates, which we did not experience in the first half of the 20th century, is that US-China rivalry for hegemony, regional or global, is creating an environment in which global cooperation is impossible. And that's weakening all sorts of international organizations, and it's creating much greater room for global inequality to have national political effects and eroding legitimacy. So I think that is a new thing in in comparison to that previous, and I find that a very concerning development that further exacerbates the tensions that democracies have in dealing with inequality and very powerful corporations.
So one thing to add to the global order and sort of power is that if we take sort of Albert Hirschman's ideas seriously, and how do you exert global power through asymmetric exposure to trade and to the sectors in which it's very difficult to substitute, and measure that over the course of the last 150 years where we have trade data. So the type of global power that China has right now, which is as a manufacturing actual powerhouse, is definitely not unprecedented. So we see the UK has much higher in absolute term power in terms of global distribution for a very long stretch of time than what China is having. And the US also for the last 50 years have much higher level. What distinct from this episode is that the rise is much faster. And this rise is, and in the previous decades also, an episode where the decay of the UK's power takes about 50 years for UK to start to see a full decay, but the decay of the US sort of export power decay seems to be relative to China's rise is at a much faster rate. That's going to complicate even more so than when you have ideological misalignment with very rapid change in global order. And that also probably spill over to a lot of the technological development sphere. When we see sort of the language that's being used, narrative that's being used on describing technology, we see sort of overwhelming large number of technology that's being described as competition, global competition, irregardless of whether the actual nature of the technological progress between, say, China and US or China and EU were actually being different to each other. So in other words, it's probably right to say that US and China are being competitive in AI, but it's very far to say US and China are being competitive in some other technology sphere where US is far ahead. But that's the overwhelming narrative on all the policy space and also in the public sort of discussion has been every technology that's coming out of China is imposed competition sort of pressure. That's going to shift a lot of the resource allocation on things where it should be cooperative and it should be sort of collaborative on that notion. So that's.
We did not say anything on the last question.
Right, so do you want to answer the questions on labor
Working
relations?
Class. Yeah, working class going back.
Working class, in China.
Oh,
there was more in Europe, I think. So in Europe or the US.
Yeah,
but I can say one. I mean, I think one issue is going to be, it's not like, I don't think it's going to be easy for working classes to go back to center left at this point. But there is another dimension of that, which is, out of this situation, you can have two very different configurations. One in which I think this welfare chauvinism in Europe in some parties, both the center left and some of the right, hard right or populist right or center right parties come up with policies that are okay or pretty good for working classes, or neither the center left nor the center right do so, which seems to be more like the US situation, which I think is the more dangerous one, again, for the legitimacy of democracy.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's where the different party configurations on the different sides of the Atlantic make a difference. I mean, I think if you were to have more populist right parties in Europe in power, you would see much more protection of the welfare state simply because that's more of the sort of incentive that they have there. The coalition is a little bit different, as I said, and welfare states have a much greater sense of sort of legitimacy and anchoring in Europe. In the United States, the problem, again, as I see it, is that the way the coalitions within both parties are configured right now, there's not a strong incentive for either one to be able to double down on what I think are the pretty dramatic economic policy changes that would be necessary to really address inequality and some of these other issues. I don't think it's impossible. I just think the current electoral configurations make it much more complicated than I think probably most people in the room would like it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, we are out of time. And please join me in thanking the three excellent panelists.
All right. Thank you so much for this great panel. I'm just going to close out with some thank yous. I'd like to thank you for joining us today on this symposium on why wealth inequality matters. Can I just take a quick poll? Does wealth inequality matter? Yes, raise your hand. All right. I'm going to call that a victory, controversial point. We're grateful to all of our panelists and chairs for sharing their time. We're immensely grateful to Jim and Kathy Stone for generously supporting our work and this center and this event. I'd also like to thank Sonia Plesset, Aaron McGowan, and Aaron Driver-Lynn from the Stone Foundation. I want to thank also Schmidt Sciences and the Novus Foundation for their support of our work. To MIT leadership, including Richard Locke, President Sally Kornbluth, the Stone Center more broadly, the Economics Department, MIT Blueprint Labs, I could go on, I will, the MIT Sloan School of Management, Rick Locke, and the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, and also our Stone Center affiliates who've joined us today and for the hard work. Our director, Catherine Moffett, our policy and research director, Julie Regier, our postdoctoral associate, Shane O'Brien, who will be giving a job talk at Berkeley in just a short while. So I embarrass her for that, but that's a sign of success. And our predoctoral fellows, including Joanne Liang, Christian Vogt, Tanish Bafna, Julie Ghani, and Lauren Q. I want to thank the team at the Sandberg Conference Center, Restaurant Associates, MIT AV, at MIT Video Productions for their help. Thank you. Finally, I want to thank all of you for being here, for participating, for asking great questions, and for making the trip here. And by the way, if you would like to be apprised of our ongoing events, there's a QR code on your agenda. You can just use it and sign up in the hallway, and we will continue. We will spam you regularly. So thanks very much. Once again, a big hand to everyone for their contributions.